And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
A new economic drama is unfolding in North America, and this time the focus is not on stock exchanges or oil, but on cars. When the White House promised to bring back manufacturing and get factories running at full capacity again, millions of Americans believed that tariffs would be the salvation. But the reality turned out to be different. Today, automotive giants are counting their losses, and assembly lines are increasingly at risk of moving abroad. And if that happens, it won't be to Asia or Europe. Manufacturers are looking just a few hundred kilometers north to Canada.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Here, unlike in the US, the rules of the game seem much more predictable. Under the protection of the CUSMA agreement, cars assembled in Canadian provinces have direct access to the American market. But it's not just about paperwork. While Washington is tightening its policies and creating additional barriers for investors, Ottawa offers a completely different picture: stability, open doors for skilled professionals, and multi-billion-dollar investments in new supply chains for electric vehicles and batteries. Imagine modern factories, each providing thousands of jobs, are being built not in Michigan or Ohio, but in Ontario. That means billions of dollars for the Canadian economy and tens of thousands of lost jobs in America. This is not an abstraction, but a reality that is increasingly being discussed by the leaders of the largest automotive companies.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
But why has what was supposed to bring manufacturing back home become a threat to the very heart of American industry? The answer lies in the details. Steel, aluminum, auto parts, all of these are now subject to tariffs that make manufacturing more expensive every week. Add to this delays in the construction of new factories and problems with hiring workers due to tightened immigration policies, and you have an explosive mixture that scares investors. Even the largest projects conceived as symbols of industrial revival are facing delays and scandals. Meanwhile, Canada is not sitting idly by. Its strategy is simple: exploit its neighbors' weaknesses and offer what the American economy lacks: predictability. This is not about loud slogans, tariff wars, or ultimatums. It is a pragmatic approach that has already led to billions of dollars of investment in battery and electric vehicle manufacturing. Today, the dilemma is clear. If the US continues to raise tariffs and restrict labor, the automotive giants will vote with their feet and move their operations to places where conditions are more stable. And then the noise of the assembly lines, which for decades has set the rhythm of Detroit, may move north to the Canadian provinces.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
This is not just a dispute over percentages and duties. It is a question of the future of an entire industry, millions of jobs, and economic leadership on the continent. Will tariffs be a tool for revival or a weapon of self-destruction? Will the US be able to keep production within the country, or will Canada become the new center of the automotive world? We will discuss this right now. The American auto industry has always been considered one of the pillars of the national economy. Hundreds of thousands of jobs, entire cities built around factories, billions in revenue for decades. All of this created a sense of unshakable stability. But recent years have shown that this confidence is beginning to crack. When Donald Trump's administration announced the introduction of large-scale tariffs, the idea seemed simple and straightforward: to make manufacturing within the US more profitable than purchasing abroad, thereby bringing businesses back home. In theory, this seemed logical, as America had indeed lost a significant portion of its industrial capacity. However, in practice, the tariff policy has resulted in increased costs, slower investment, and growing uncertainty about the future. The financial reports of the largest car manufacturers speak for themselves. General Motors recorded $1 billion drop in profits in just one quarter. Stellantis announced losses of more than $2.5 billion in the first half of the year. Ford, whose results were expected later, was also at risk, and analysts warned in advance of a similar trend. For companies with multi-billion-dollar turnovers, such figures may seem manageable at first glance, but it is important to understand the context. These losses did not arise from a crisis in demand or a sharp drop in sales, but solely from an increase in production costs caused by tariffs. When the basis of costs, steel, aluminum, and thousands of components supplied from around the world suddenly becomes tens of % more expensive, even giants begin to feel the squeeze.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Within the industry, this is called the tariff paradox. Measures designed to protect domestic production ultimately make it less competitive. American factories are forced to buy materials at higher prices than their foreign competitors. Moreover, many suppliers within the US itself depend on imported parts, and now they too are under attack. The result is a chain reaction. The cost of basic materials rises, intermediate components become more expensive, and the cost of the final car increases. As a result, the manufacturer loses margin, and the consumer faces rising prices at the dealership. This spiral is spinning faster and faster. According to estimates by the Center for Automotive Research, tariffs on cars and parts alone could add about $18 billion in additional costs in 2025. And that's without taking into account the 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, as well as a host of related costs. Experts warn that if companies start passing these costs on to buyers, affordable models will disappear from the market. Dealers are already seeing prices for popular sedans and crossovers rise by an average of 7 to 10%, which is becoming a serious barrier for many American families. It is at this point that automakers are turning their attention north. Canada appears to be facing the same conditions of global competition, but the key difference is predictability. The CUSMA agreement remains in force here, ensuring free access for Canadian cars to the US market. This means that assembling a car in Ontario or Quebec does not involve the tariff risks that weigh on American investors on a daily basis. Moreover, the Canadian government's immigration policy makes it easier to attract skilled engineers and workers, which is particularly important for projects related to electric vehicles and batteries.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Against the backdrop of these factors, a contrast is emerging that is difficult to ignore. In the US, businesses are facing growing uncertainty. Tariffs can change at any moment, the rules of the game are becoming stricter, and costs are constantly rising. In Canada, the picture is different: stable conditions, clear tax incentives, and active support for new technologies. Over the past 3 years, more than $15 billion in investments in battery plants and electric vehicle component manufacturing have been announced in Ontario. By comparison, similar projects in a number of US states have either been frozen or delayed due to legal and financial risks. Unofficial data appearing in the business press adds fuel to the fire. According to industry sources, several major automakers are already considering plans to move new production lines to Canada. One of them is reportedly exploring the possibility of building a plant in Ontario with a capacity of up to 250,000 cars per year. If this project goes ahead, the US risks losing up to 3,000 jobs at this one plant alone and tens of thousands more in related sectors. For Detroit and Michigan, which have been symbols of automotive power for decades, such a scenario sounds like a blow to the heart. Canada is not just winning because of its stability. It is actively shaping its own image as a new center of the automotive industry. Entire clusters for electric vehicles are being created here, where an electric motor manufacturing plant is being built next to a battery factory, and a research center for new materials is opening nearby. All this creates a synergy effect, with companies gravitating towards each other and logistics and interaction costs falling. This is what sets Canada apart from the US, where tariff battles mean that many projects are implemented in a piecemeal fashion and companies are wary of investing billions in the long term. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that US tariff policy undermines the confidence of foreign partners. When the rules of the game change suddenly and decisions are made under political pressure, it becomes difficult for businesses to make plans for decades ahead. Economists are increasingly using the term Trumpian uncertainty, emphasizing that the very unpredictability of politics has become a risk factor. For the auto industry, where each new production facility requires billions in investment and decades of planning, this is perhaps the worst-case scenario.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Canada, on the other hand, is demonstrating the opposite approach. It is betting on long-term guarantees and building alliances. And while the scale of its economy is incomparable to that of the US, it is precisely predictability that is becoming its main trump card. Automakers, tired of constant fluctuations and threats of new tariffs, increasingly see their northern neighbor as a safe haven where they can develop projects without the risk of a sudden blow to their business. Thus, the first 2 points of the plan form a clear picture. The US finds itself trapped by its own tariff strategy. Rising costs and uncertainty are stifling the industry that was supposed to benefit from the new measures. Meanwhile, Canada is gradually becoming an alternative center of attraction for investment, offering not loud slogans but predictability and a ready-made infrastructure for the future of the automotive industry. When it comes to the consequences of a possible relocation of factories from the US to Canada, many people imagine only direct job losses. But in reality, the picture is much bigger. A modern car factory is not just a few thousand employees working on the assembly line. It is hundreds of supplier companies, dozens of logistics operators, thousands of services and local businesses that depend on stable orders. A single plant in Ontario can produce more than 200,000 cars per year, and the total output, at an average cost of $30,000 per car, reaches $6 billion. Now multiply those figures by 3 if General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis decide to locate new lines in Canada. We get $18 billion in annual production that leaves the American economy. For Canada, these figures are a driver of growth, but for the US, they are a painful loss. Dry statistical calculations do not reflect the human scale of the problem. Each plant directly employs 2,000 to 3,000 people, but for every such worker, there are another 5 or 6 indirect jobs: suppliers of parts, transport companies, cafes, shops and schools that thrive thanks to the presence of a stable manufacturing giant in the region. If 9,000 direct jobs disappear in America, then, taking into account the multiplier effect, the country could lose more than 50,000. For Detroit or Toledo, this means another wave of closed houses, empty streets, and dying suburbs. Economists warn that such processes always trigger a chain reaction. Young families move to other regions, property values fall, the tax base shrinks, and cities lose their ability to maintain infrastructure. What looks like a loss of a few thousand jobs on paper turns into a social crisis in reality.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to US IEEPA tariffs.
The Canadian side, on the contrary, receives a powerful boost. New factories mean not only manufacturing jobs, but also the accelerated development of entire industries. Research centers specializing in the development of batteries and technologies for electric vehicles are already being built in Ontario. In Montreal, local universities, with the support of federal programs, are launching master's courses to train engineers specifically for the automotive sector. These initiatives are laying the groundwork for Canada to establish itself as a new hub for innovative automotive manufacturing. The scenario in which a country that until recently was considered merely an extension of American manufacturing is becoming an equal player on the continent is no longer a fantasy. At the same time, US tariff policy is creating new obstacles even for projects that remain within the country. Since June, imports of steel and aluminum have been subject to a 50% tariff. This is critical for automakers. Metal accounts for up to a third of the cost of a car. But the tariffs do not only apply to basic materials. Dozens of categories of components, from suspension parts to air conditioning systems, are subject to the new duties. Each of them may seem insignificant on its own, but together they make manufacturing in the US less and less profitable. When a company is forced to overpay for every nut and bolt and every cable, its competitiveness in the global market rapidly declines. The effect is felt not only by manufacturers, but also by consumers. At dealerships, car prices are rising faster than buyers' salaries. The Center for Automotive Research warns that if current tariffs remain in place, the cost of mass-market models could increase so much that they will no longer be affordable. Already today, the price of new cars in the US has risen by an average of 12% compared to last year, and this is not due to inflation or a surge in demand. It is a direct consequence of tariffs which are passed on to the end consumer. At a time when American families are already under pressure from rising housing and food costs, cars are becoming yet another symbol of an unattainable dream. The electric vehicle segment has been hit the hardest. Despite loud statements about the need to develop environmentally friendly transport, the US still lacks a full-fledged infrastructure for battery production. Most batteries are still imported from Asia. These imports are now subject to high tariffs, making the production of electric vehicles in America extremely costly. As a result, companies are forced to either scale back their production plans or move production to places where access to battery technology is cheaper and more stable. Canada is in an advantageous position in this regard. Multi-billion-dollar contracts have already been signed here for the construction of lithium-ion battery factories, and these projects are actively funded by the federal government. For global corporations, this is a signal that their northern neighbor is ready to provide a full production cycle, from batteries to final vehicle assembly.
In fact, the average US tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Some of the consequences of the tariffs are even more unexpected. In the US, prices have risen even for goods such as leather, textiles, and car interior components. These materials, imported from Asia, are now more expensive, and manufacturers are forced to look for substitutes or reduce quality. There have already been complaints from buyers that the new models of some popular brands are inferior in finish to the same versions released 2 or 3 years ago. Reputational losses in such a competitive industry can be just as painful as financial ones. Looking at the bigger picture, the situation is alarming. On the one hand, the US is losing jobs and facing rising prices. On the other hand, Canada is strengthening its position and is ready to offer investors everything that its southern neighbor lacks: stable rules, cheap resources, and political predictability. The potential relocation of factories is not a what-if threat, but a logical result of existing conditions. And if the situation does not change in the coming years, American cities accustomed to the noise of conveyor belts may become shadows of their former selves, while Canadian regions will have a chance for economic growth. Thus, the third and fourth points of the plan show 2 interrelated processes. The losses to the US are measured not only in billions of dollars, but also in social upheaval. The benefits to Canada go far beyond individual factories, shaping a new industrial landscape on the continent. All this has been made possible by tariffs, which were conceived as a tool for revival but have become a catalyst for the flow of capital and technology across the border.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The situation has turned out to be even more difficult for businesses. Companies that depend on metal-intensive components have begun to scale back their expansion plans. Agricultural machinery manufacturers have reported a drop in orders, as farmers are refusing to upgrade their equipment amid rising prices. A paradox has arisen in construction. On the one hand, the state is stimulating infrastructure development, but on the other, high prices for cranes, pumps, and construction machinery are making projects tens of millions of dollars more expensive. According to the Builders Association, in the Midwest alone, the cost of some projects has risen by an average of 15%, and some tenders have had to be cancelled altogether. This has been an additional blow to the automotive industry. Whereas companies previously at least attempted to offset rising costs through internal optimization, now even that has become impossible. Supply chains are too intertwined with global markets. When tariffs are imposed not only on metal, but also on interior parts and electronics, no amount of localization can save the day. As a result, automakers find themselves in a position where each new batch of cars automatically becomes more expensive than those of their European or Asian competitors.